There are places where stone speaks louder than history, where the silence of the gardens is more eloquent than thousands of archival documents. Stan Hywet Hall is one of those places. At dawn, when the mist still clings to the ancient oaks, it seems perfect. Flawless masonry, the precise geometry of hedgerows, the reflection of towers in the still water of the pond. Today, it is a National Historic Landmark, a dream of American aristocracy frozen in time, where people line up to touch a bygone era. Above the main entrance, like an eternal oath, a motto is carved: Non nobis solum. Not for us alone. Noble words, a lie carved in stone, or perhaps a prophecy whose meaning not even its creator understood. Because this stone was not bought with old aristocratic money. It was forged in the soot and sweat of a city known as the rubber capital of the world, the city of Akron, Ohio. This facade, imitating the tranquility of a 16th century English manor, was paid for by the roar of factories, the fury of patent wars, and the desperation of thousands of workers demanding an 8-hour day. This house was built for one man, and for him alone. His name was Frank Seiberling. Height, 5'5". Ambition, limitless. Behind his back, they called him the Little Napoleon of the Rubber Empire, a man for whom the world was nothing more than raw material, and competition a form of war. His workers saw him as a ruthless exploiter, his rivals a tactical genius who knew no mercy. The newspaper headlines of the time are a chronicle of his battles. Strike in Akron paralyzes production. Goodyear accuses Firestone of industrial espionage. Seiberling wins patent war. And in the midst of this industrial hell, this relentless struggle for power and money, he decided to build his paradise, his castle, his fortress, which was meant to declare to the whole world, I have won. My dynasty will last forever. But stone remembers everything. It remembers the price paid for every perfectly hewn block. It remembers the shouts of strikers echoing from the factories in the valley, while here, on the hill, Italian artisans carved family crests from wood. Today, this is a place of peace, but it was born from conflict. Today, it belongs to everyone, but it was conceived as a monument to one man's ego. How did the fortress of an industrial baron, whose name was synonymous with struggle, become a symbol of healing and hope for millions? To understand this, we must go back to the beginning, to the origins of a fortune that smelled of rubber, gunpowder, and blood. Empires are not born from nothing. They don't appear at the snap of a finger. They begin with a seed. Sometimes it's an idea, sometimes desperation, and sometimes it's simply a debt. Frank Seiberling's empire began in 1898 with a sum that seems laughable today, $3,500, borrowed from his brother-in-law. With that money, he bought a bankrupt strawboard factory. He had no experience in the rubber business, no unique technology, but he had the instinct of a predator, and his first move was brilliant in its cynicism. He named his company after a man who had died in poverty 38 years earlier, Charles Goodyear, the inventor of vulcanization. Seiberling had no right to the name, but he understood that in the world of new capital, history is a commodity. He didn't invent rubber. He invented a brand. He bought himself a phantom partner whose name was already a legend. The early years were modest. Bicycle tires, horseshoes, poker chips. But Seiberling was looking further, at the dusty roads of America, where the first self-propelled carriages rumbled. In 1903, he placed a bet on the future. He patented the world's first tubeless automobile tire. It was a technological breakthrough, but technology without a market is nothing. The market arrived in 1907. His name was Henry Ford. Ford was creating his people's car, the Model T, and he needed tires. Thousands of them, cheap and reliable. Seiberling struck a deal that transformed him from a merely successful manufacturer into an industrial titan. By 1912, the Goodyear factories were supplying Ford with 1,200 tires a day. This was no longer a stream of income. It was a flood, a golden flood that threatened to wash away all his competitors. But this gold had a source, and it was located thousands of miles from Ohio, in the humid, suffocating air of Sumatra. To control supply and prices, Seiberling acquired 20,000 acres of rubber plantations. Every drop of latex, collected by an unknown worker for a few cents, became an invisible brick in the wall of his future palace. Every dollar that should have gone to improving working conditions on those plantations went instead to buying marble and tapestries. Seiberling's wealth was built not only on American ingenuity, but also on the silent, grueling labor of people whose names history has not preserved. At home in America, the war was being fought on another front. It was a war of patents and prices. His main enemy lived just a few miles away, Harvey Firestone. Their rivalry was not just competition. It was a personal vendetta between two industrial monarchs fighting for the same territory. They spied on each other, poached engineers, and sued each other over every nut, bolt, and inch of rubber. Seiberling was ruthless. He saw the world as an arena, and in that arena, only the strongest survived. And then, the skies of Europe caught fire. The First World War. For millions, it was a tragedy. For Frank Seiberling, it was the greatest business opportunity of his life. He created a division for building airships. These silent gray giants, patrolling the coast for German submarines, were a symbol of a new era of warfare, and every minute of their flight, every government contract, echoed with the deafening clang of the cash register in his Akron factories. By the end of the war, Frank Seiberling was not just a rich man. He was a force of nature. His fortune had been forged from risk, brilliant calculation, ruthless exploitation, and global conflict. Money was no longer the goal. It had become fuel for an ambition that could no longer be contained within the walls of an ordinary house. The money had been made. Now it had to be turned into stone, into a statement, into immortality. In 1911, Frank Seiberling stood on a hilltop overlooking Akron. Beneath his feet was not earth. It was an abandoned quarry, a scar on the body of Ohio, gouged out and left behind. But Seiberling didn't see that. Where others saw barren rock and weeds, he saw a stage for his triumph. He wasn't looking for a place to build a home. He was looking for a pedestal. He didn't need a mansion. Akron had enough mansions. He wanted a castle, a dynastic castle that would scream from this hill to the entire world. His message was simple and audacious. A rubber baron from provincial Ohio was in no way inferior to the steel kings of Pittsburgh and the railroad magnates of New York. He could look upon the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Vanderbilts as an equal. Their money was old, steeped in the smell of coal and machine oil. His money smelled of fresh rubber, and he was going to prove it weighed just as much. To do this, he needed the right language, the language of architecture. He hired Cleveland architect Charles Schneider, rejecting the more fashionable masters from the East Coast. It was a calculated move. He was building his empire in Ohio, and its monument would be raised by Ohio hands. Together, they went through styles. Neoclassical, too formal, too governmental. Art Nouveau, too frivolous. Their choice fell on Tudor revival. This wasn't a nod to fashion. This was the purchase of history, The Tudor style, imitating 16th century English country estates, was the perfect camouflage. It created the illusion of centuries, the illusion of old money. Massive beams, steep-pitched roofs, leaded glass windows. Every element was carefully selected to convey substance, aristocracy, and above all, permanence. Seiberling, a self-made man who came from nothing, was building a home that had to look as if it had belonged to his family for generations. It was a brilliant architectural falsification. Even the name was part of this grand production. He didn't call it Villa Seiberling or the Goodyear estate. He chose a name from the very earth on which he stood. Stan Hywet, Old English for hewn stone. A name that sounded as if it were 500 years old. It connected the new dynasty to nature itself, to the eternity of stone. It was a masterful PR move, encrypted in 2 ancient words. Every line on Schneider's blueprints was not just an architectural decision, but a line in Seiberling's manifesto. 64,500 square feet, 65 rooms, 23 bathrooms. These weren't just numbers. They were weapons in a war of prestige. The Great Hall, with its 30-foot ceiling, was not designed for quiet family evenings. It was designed as a throne room, capable of hosting hundreds of guests, where deals would be made and the destinies of the Midwest would be forged. The music room, with its gigantic organ, was not just a place for making music. It was a private philharmonic hall, intended to prove that an industrialist could appreciate high art as much as stock market reports. Stan Hywet wasn't being built. It was making a statement. It declared power, wealth, and the right to a place in history. This was architecture turned into a weapon. Seiberling, who had conquered the world of rubber, now intended to conquer time. He came. He built. And he was absolutely certain he would remain here forever. Before Frank Seiberling could challenge history, he had to declare war on the land itself. The place he chose for his castle was not an idyllic meadow. It was a rebellion of nature, an abandoned quarry, scarred and barren, fetid swamps swarming with mosquitoes, hills overgrown with a wild, untamable forest. It was a landscape of chaos, and Seiberling was a man of order. His first enemy was the stone. Granite boulders left over from the Ice Age and sandstone fragments abandoned by quarry workers littered the ground. Seiberling approached this problem the same way he approached conquering a market, with deafening force. Dynamite. Dozens of explosions shook the surrounding area, turning age-old boulders into dust and rubble. Workers, like an army of ants, cleared the ground for the future construction. It was a fight to the death of untamed nature for the birth of a man-made paradise. Then came the water. The swamps, breeding grounds for disease, had to be drained. Engineers laid miles of drainage pipes, diverting the stagnant water, literally squeezing the life out of the bogs. Where frogs once croaked, English roses were now meant to bloom. It was a direct intervention in the ecosystem, the subjugation of nature to the will of one man, a man accustomed to the world bending to him. But Seiberling understood that brute force was not enough. He needed a strategist, a general for his landscape war. He hired Warren H. Manning, one of America's greatest landscape architects. Manning was no simple gardener. He was a director of nature. His task wasn't just to decorate the land around the house. His task was to create a perfect world. Manning approached the job with surgical precision. He studied every sketch of the future mansion. He knew where every window would be placed. And for every window, he designed its own unique, directed view. From the library window, one was to see a long birch alley stretching into the distance, creating a sense of infinite perspective and seclusion. From the dining room windows, the view was of the bright, symmetrical flower beds of the English garden, emphasizing order and civilization. And from Seiberling's own bedroom, a panoramic view opened up of the valley where his factories smoked. It was the view of a general, gazing down from on high at his empire. This was the total manipulation of reality. Trees did not grow wherever they pleased. They were planted in strictly determined spots to create the desired composition. The paths did not follow the natural terrain. They were curved to lead the viewer's gaze toward pre-selected, picturesque spots. Manning even designed artificial ruins to give the landscape a romantic touch of antiquity. He wasn't just shaping the landscape. He was painting it, like an artist paints a picture, using trees for paint and hills for a canvas. The entire estate, originally 3,000 acres, was transformed into a giant film set where nature was merely an actress, playing a role written for her by man. This was the ultimate declaration of control. The industrialist, accustomed to subjugating markets, patents, and people, now sought to subjugate the land itself. He leveled hills, drained swamps, blasted rocks, and dictated to the trees where they should grow. He wasn't just building a house, he was building his own Eden, having banished from it everything primordial and chaotic. But he did not yet know that nature, like history, cannot be controlled forever. 1913. On the hill above Akron, a symphony is born, a symphony of creation. The hammers of stonemasons beat a rhythm on sandstone. Winches creak, hoisting massive oak beams. Italian masters hum to themselves as they carve intricate designs into the limestone. The air smells of fresh wood shavings, damp clay, and money. Here, in the quiet and far from the city, a dream is being built. But if you listened closely, you could catch another sound. A roar. A low, threatening roar, rising from the valley. It wasn't the noise of the factories. The factories were silent. It was the roar of thousands of angry voices. Down below, in the soot-stained streets of Akron, another symphony was raging. A cacophony of rebellion. The Great Rubber Strike of 1913. Tens of thousands of workers took to the streets. Their faces were haggard, their hands black with soot, their demands simple and desperate. An 8-hour workday, the right to unionize, a shred of human dignity. They were the very army that created the fabulous wealth of Frank Seiberling. And now, that army had risen up. It was a perfect, cruel parallel montage, directed by life itself. Up on the hill, workers in clean overalls were laying slate tiles brought from Vermont, creating a roof for one man. Down in the streets, workers in tattered clothes marched under a hail of stones and police batons, demanding a roof over their own families' heads. Every hammer blow against stone on the hill echoed with the anger in the streets below. Seiberling himself stood between these two worlds. In his temporary office, he sat at a desk piled high with papers. On one side lay the architectural blueprints for his paradise, detailed plans for the English garden, sketches for the stained glass windows of the Great Hall. On the other, reports from his managers on the progress of the strike, lists of fired activists, telegrams demanding harsh measures to suppress the unions. To him, they were two sides of the same coin. The palace was the symbol of his success. The strike was just an annoying obstacle on his path, a problem in an accounting ledger that needed to be solved. He didn't see living people in those men with picket signs. He saw them as cogs in his giant machine that had suddenly started to malfunction, and the machine had to run, uninterrupted, generating profit. Profit that, at this very moment, was being transformed into the walls of his fortress. and Stan Hywet was, indeed, becoming a fortress. A fortress being raised not against a foreign enemy, but against his own people. Its high walls and remote location were not simply an architectural choice. They were a physical barrier, separating the world of order and luxury from the world of chaos and poverty that paid for that order and luxury. The palace was deaf to the cries from the valley. It grew, stone by stone, a majestic and silent reproach to the thousands who had laid its foundation with their blood and sweat. The walls that were meant to symbolize greatness became a symbol of alienation. The foundation, laid in the soil of Ohio, turned out to be mixed with the deepest class divide in America. The palace was being built, but it was already under siege. The Stan Hywet construction site wasn't just a construction site. It was an anthill of creation, a city within a city, erected on a single hill. If you had soared above it in those years, you wouldn't have seen chaos, but a complex, living organism. 2,000 people, 2,000 destinies, ambitions, and desperate hopes gathered in one place by the will of one man. It was an army of immigrants building an American castle. Here, in the heart of Ohio, its own Babylon bustled. You could hear snippets of conversation in a dozen languages. The sharp, guttural Italian of stonemasons from Tuscany, whose ancestors had built cathedrals, now carving crests for the rubber king. The deep, rolling German of carpenters from Bavaria, arguing over the precise joining of American chestnut beams. And over it all, the rough Irish brogue of laborers doing the hardest, dirtiest work, hauling stone and mixing mortar, singing songs of the land they had left behind. Every one of them came to America for a dream, and here they were, building it. But not for themselves. They were erecting another man's triumph, hoping that the few dollars earned on this hill would become the first stone in the foundation of their own modest American lives. This place was a melting pot, not born of noble intentions, but of pure necessity. Seiberling needed the best hands, and he didn't care what language those hands used to ask for their pay. But the people were only one part of this gigantic mechanism. The other was logistics. Logistics comparable to preparing for a military campaign. 18 types of wood. 18. Oak and maple were felled right here in the estate's forests, tying the house to its land. But the rest was a journey. Sandalwood from Asia, teak from Burma, and the most precious, American chestnut, a majestic tree already being devoured by blight, turning it into a ghost. Seiberling was, in essence, preserving an endangered species within the walls of his home. Every carved chestnut-paneled ceiling is not just decoration. It is an epitaph for an entire forest. And the roof? 97 tons of slate. 97 tons. The weight of a locomotive. It was quarried in Vermont, loaded onto trains, shipped halfway across the country, and then, on horse-drawn carts, slowly, with inhuman effort, hauled up this hill. Every single tile laid in place was the final link in an incredible chain of effort, paid for by money that flowed like a river from the factories in the valley. Stan Hywet became the temporary center of the world. Stone, wood, metal, glass. It all converged here, at this one point, to be assembled into a single whole according to the blueprints on the architect's table. And over it all, invisible yet omnipotent, hovered the spirit of Seiberling himself. He was not a foreman, but a conductor. His will was the glue that held this Babylon together, preventing it from collapsing into 1,000 separate stories and languages. He had assembled a giant machine of people and materials. But this was only the facade, the visible part of the miracle. This house, which pretended to be a medieval castle on the outside, was something much more. It was a machine, and like any modern machine, its true genius was hidden deep within. On the outside, Stan Hywet was a magnificent stage set, a perfect imitation of the 16th century, created to convince the world of the Seiberling family's ancient lineage. But if you could peel back its stone skin, you would see not the past, but the future. Behind the thick walls, beneath the oak panels and carved ceilings, hid another house, a 20th century technological marvel. It was the ghost in the machine, the ghost of progress, dressed in a historical costume. Frank Seiberling was, above all, an innovator, a man who had made his fortune on patents and new technologies, and he had no intention of living in a real medieval castle with its drafts, darkness, and discomfort. He wanted comfort, absolute, total comfort, the kind that only the most advanced technologies of his time could provide. His house had to be more than just beautiful. It had to be smart. Let's start with the invisible. Beneath the floorboards, within the walls, in the cellars, a complex circulatory and nervous system was laid out. Miles of copper pipes carried hot and cold water to 19 bathrooms, an unheard-of luxury for a time when most Americans didn't even have one. But that was only the beginning. Another, more mysterious network of pipes spread throughout the house. It led to small brass outlets in every room. This was the central vacuum system. A maid simply had to connect a hose to one of these ports, and all the dust, all the debris, would be sucked into a giant unit in the basement. The house breathed. It cleaned itself. And communication. Seiberling, who ran a global empire, could not be cut off from the world. An internal telephone system connected 59 points in the house. Without leaving his desk, he could give an order to the kitchen, speak with the head gardener in the conservatory, or summon his chauffeur from the garage. It was a private switchboard, a personal nervous system that allowed him to manage his small kingdom with the same efficiency he used to run the Goodyear factories. Electricity. In those years, many American cities were still lit by gas lamps, but Stan Hywet was fully electrified, and not just connected to the city grid. It had its own power plant, a 75-kilowatt generator hidden in a separate building could have powered a small village. Seiberling depended on no one. He generated his own light that flooded his halls and the energy that powered his machines. Even the air in the house was controlled. A complex system of ventilation and steam heating maintained a comfortable temperature in all 65 rooms. 1,100 feet of chimneys, hidden in the walls, serviced 25 fireplaces that were more for decoration than necessity. This was the greatest paradox of Stan Hywet. A house that tried with all its might to appear ancient was, in fact, an ultra-modern machine for living. Seiberling, a genius of mass production, applied his principles to his own dwelling. He created a perfect machine, packaged in a shell from the past. Every stone of the facade was paid for by innovations in tire manufacturing. And every innovation inside the house was hidden behind that stone. It was a triumph of engineering disguised as a triumph of architecture. He built not just a house, but a living organism, where technology served as invisible servants, ensuring the flawless performance of the illusion. If technology was the hidden engine of Stan Hywet, then its soul was woven from an elaborate lie. This wasn't merely an imitation of antiquity. It was the art of falsification, brought to perfection. Frank Seiberling could not inherit history, so he decided to commission it, pay for it, and build it into the walls of his home. Every element of the decor, every detail, was part of a grand performance designed to convince the world, and perhaps himself, of the authenticity of his aristocracy. Take the Great Hall, the heart of the home. Its floor was laid with massive oak planks, but new oak would have looked new, too smooth, too perfect. Seiberling couldn't allow that, so he ordered the workers to take heavy chains and whip the newly laid floor. Hour after hour, day after day, they left dents, scratches, scars. Then, the floor was rubbed with special compounds to work dirt into these artificial wounds. They weren't just building a floor. They were creating a biography for it. They were giving it 100 years of a life it never lived, filled with the fictional footsteps of knights and the rustle of court ladies' gowns. This obsession with detail was everywhere. Woodcarvers, brought over from Europe, worked for weeks on the paneling and ceilings. But they didn't just carve standard ornaments. They wove the Seiberling family's personal mythology into them. Here, hidden in the ornate pattern above the fireplace, are the initials FAS, Frank Augustus Seiberling. And there, in the intertwining leaves, GPS, Gertrude Penfield Seiberling. Chrysanthemums, the lady of the house's favorite flower, bloomed on the wooden cornices. This was the heraldry of the nouveau riche, secret symbols understood only by the initiated, meant to confirm this family's right to this castle. And the stained glass? In European castles, they told the stories of saints and biblical prophets. But Seiberling was building an American pantheon. In the windows of his dining room, instead of apostles, there were depictions of American pioneers and explorers, Lewis and Clark, Daniel Boone. It was a bold statement. Our history is no less important than yours. Our saints are the people who conquered a continent. We, the Seiberlings, are their direct heirs, the pioneers of the industrial age. Even what was supposed to be authentic was subjected to careful selection and improvement. Seiberling sent agents to England to buy up entire rooms from crumbling Tudor manors. Wooden panels, mantelpieces, even ceilings were disassembled, numbered, loaded onto ships, and sent to Ohio. Here, at Stan Hywet, they were reassembled like a giant puzzle. But if any element didn't fit the perfect picture, it was mercilessly corrected, with details added or removed. This was not restoration. It was an edit. Seiberling wasn't preserving history. He was directing it, cutting the boring scenes and adding special effects. Everything in this house was part of a myth, the myth of a man who didn't just achieve success, but who was always destined for it. Stan Hywet was not just a dwelling. It was the physical proof of this invented destiny. Every aged brick, every carved monogram, every stained glass pioneer, it was all a prop in the grand production titled The Seiberling Dynasty. He wasn't building a house, but a legend, and he was its first and most devoted spectator. While workers in Ohio were artificially aging oak floors, in Europe, history was aging for real, at a frightening speed. 1917. America enters the First World War. The Great War, raging across the ocean, seemed so far away. But its ice-cold breath reached even the hills of Akron, shattering the plans of Frank Seiberling. Reality invaded his meticulously constructed world. The war severed the arteries through which luxury goods flowed to his estate. Ships that once carried marble from Carrara and tapestries from Flanders now transported soldiers and ammunition. The ocean turned into a combat zone. Shipments ceased. The architect, Charles Schneider, and the decorators found themselves at a dead end. Some rooms in the mansion, which was already nearly complete, remained unfinished, as if frozen in silent anticipation of peace. They had to improvise. Instead of Italian marble for the bathrooms, they began using American marble from Vermont and Georgia. Instead of European fabrics, the products of local manufactories. This forced substitution became an unwitting symbol. The house, intended to be a monument to European aristocratic tradition, was involuntarily becoming more and more American. The war, without intending to, was forcing Seiberling to rely on the resources of his own country. But this war had another face. For the builders of Stan Hywet, it was a problem. For the owner of Goodyear, it was a gold mine. The very same conflict that halted the delivery of tapestries created an unprecedented demand for Seiberling's other product: rubber. Tires for military trucks, rubber for gas masks, and of course, airships. These giants, bearing the Goodyear name, became the eyes of the American Navy. They patrolled the Atlantic, hunting down the German submarines that were sinking the ships carrying marble and fabrics. A vicious, closed circle emerged. The war created problems for the mansion's construction, but it also financed it with unprecedented generosity. Every military contract signed in Washington turned into wages for the masons and carpenters in Akron. Every rotation of an airship's propeller over the cold ocean waters paid for another yard of silk wallpaper or another crystal chandelier. Stan Hywet was built on a paradox. It was simultaneously a victim of the war and its main beneficiary. Seiberling, like many industrialists of that era, was fighting his own personal war on two fronts. On one, he battled material shortages to complete his palace. On the other, he reaped colossal profits from the global slaughter. The echo of the cannonade from the fields of Flanders reached quiet Ohio, not as the sound of explosions, but as the jingle of coins. Money that smelled of gunpowder was laundered in the luxury of the interiors. The blood spilled in the trenches turned into the wine destined to fill the glasses in his future dining hall. The house was being completed. It grew more magnificent, more perfect. But in its foundation, next to the hewn stone, there remained forever the invisible but indelible trace of the greatest tragedy of that time. Finally, at the end of 1915, the family moved in. The war was still raging in Europe, but here, on the hill, a fragile, artificial peace reigned. The final, most intoxicating phase began, furnishing the house. If construction was the creation of the body, now the Seiberlings were breathing a soul into it, a soul woven from silk, silver, and unrestrained luxury. Agents scurried through the auction houses of New York and London, buying up antiques. Rugs from Persia, porcelain from Limoges, 17th century tapestries depicting hunting scenes. Every item was not just a piece of furniture, it was a trophy, proof of taste, and of course, wealth. In the music room, they installed a giant Aeolian organ with 2,748 pipes. Its roar could drown out the noise of an entire factory. This was not just an instrument, it was a cathedral built inside a house. A series of receptions began, intended to solidify Stan Hywet's status as the White House of the Midwest. Hundreds of guests, champagne flowing like a river, an orchestra playing in the Great Hall. Seiberling, standing on the upper gallery and looking down at this glittering sea of people, must have felt like he was on top of the world. His dream had come true. He hadn't just built a house. He had built a stage for his triumph, and now the performance had begun. But while music played at Stan Hywet, entirely different notes were sounding in the business world. Anxious, false. The post-war economy, inflated by military contracts, began to falter. The recession of 1920 to 1921 arrived. The demand for rubber plummeted. Goodyear's warehouses were overstocked with tires nobody needed. And the debts were snowballing. A frightening dissonance emerged. The more luxurious the house became, the closer financial disaster crept. Each new Persian rug laid on the floor corresponded to a drop in Goodyear's stock on the exchange. Every silver fork bought for the dining room was paid for with money the company, in reality, no longer had. Seiberling was literally completing and furnishing his monument to success with the money of an empire that was already crumbling beneath his feet. He was like the captain of a sinking ship who, instead of patching the holes, orders the deck to be polished and dinner to be served in his cabin. Perhaps he believed in his own genius, that he could, as before, break free from any crisis. Perhaps he simply refused to see the obvious, or most likely, he had already invested so much money, so much ambition, so much of himself into this house that he couldn't stop. To stop would have meant admitting defeat, and the little Napoleon did not admit defeat. The tension grew with each passing day. Outwardly, everything was perfect. Guests admired the splendor. Newspapers described the glittering receptions. But behind this facade, a quiet panic was hiding. Seiberling was holding a feast during a plague. He was dancing on the edge of a precipice, and the music in his great hall could barely drown out the sound of the ice cracking beneath his feet. The palace was almost finished, but the kingdom for which it was built was already in its death throes. 1921. The collapse. It didn't come with the roar of cannons or the cries of a rioting mob. It came quietly, in the rustle of papers and the polite but steely voices of men in expensive suits. These were the bankers from Wall Street, the surgeons of capital from the firm Dillon, Reed & Company. They weren't there to storm Seiberling's fortress. They had simply come to collect the keys. The Goodyear Company, the giant he had created from nothing, was suffocating in debt. The stocks, worth a fortune just recently, had turned to garbage. Seiberling scrambled, sought loans, tried to negotiate, but it was already too late. He lost control. The bankers offered him a deal that was an ultimatum: debt restructuring in exchange for complete control of the company. To save his creation, he had to renounce it. It was a palace coup, carried out in the sterile silence of New York offices. Not a single shot was fired. He was simply forced out. Frank Seiberling, the little Napoleon, the founder and undisputed ruler of the rubber empire, was exiled from his own kingdom. Overnight, he lost everything: the company, the power, the fortune. At that very moment, Stan Hywet Hall, his greatest triumph, transformed into its opposite. It ceased to be a symbol of power and became a gigantic, unbearable burden. Every stone that was meant to shout of his success now silently reminded him of his fall. The 65 rooms became 65 empty halls, echoing his former power. The 22 servants, whom he could no longer afford, became a living reproach. He found himself a king without a kingdom, a monarch in exile, locked in his own castle. He could wander its endless corridors, touch the cold marble, look at the portraits of ancestors he never had. But all of it was now just a set, luxurious but meaningless. The house, built as the command post of an empire, had become his personal prison, a golden cage he had so painstakingly built for himself. He was still Frank Seiberling, and his will was not broken. At the age of 62, he would start all over, creating a new, smaller company. But the magic was gone. He would never again reclaim that scale, that scope, that absolute power. The irony was cruel. He built Stan Hywet to secure his dynasty in eternity, but the moment the last nail was hammered and the last tapestry was hung, the dynasty collapsed. He completed his monument at the very moment that nothing was left of what it was dedicated to, except memories. He stood in the middle of his masterpiece, surrounded by a magnificence he could no longer maintain. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he understood that there are things you cannot control. That stone can outlive a man, but it cannot save him from his fate. By the end of the 20s, it seemed things couldn't get any worse. Frank Seiberling, having founded a new company, was slowly regaining his financial stability, but the shadow of the Great Depression was already falling over the country. Money, already scarce for the upkeep of the gigantic estate, was now worth its weight in gold. The family had to dismiss almost all the servants, close off entire wings of the house, and learn to live in their palace as ordinary people live in ordinary homes, by saving on everything. But the most terrible blow fate had in store for the Seiberlings was not a financial one. There was a place in the estate that seemed the quintessence of luxury and engineering: the indoor swimming pool, not just a pit with water, but a true Roman thermal sanctuary. Vaults painted to look like a starry sky, marble columns, heated water. It was a place of joy, laughter, and family recreation. The technological heart of the house, designed for happiness. The year was 1929, a quiet summer day. Frank's 9-year-old grandson, his namesake, Frank Seiberling III, was playing by the pool. What happened in the next moments, no one knows for sure. There were no screams, no struggle. There was only silence and water. The very same water that was heated by a complex system of pipes. The very same water that was purified by the most modern filters. The very same water that was a symbol of a carefree life. It became a silent killer. The boy drowned. The tragedy was absolute, irrational, like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. It split the family's life in two. The house, which had been designed as a cradle for future generations, as an ancestral home where the dynasty was supposed to flourish and continue, became a place of unbearable grief. This death forever changed the atmosphere within the walls of Stan Hywet. The joy was gone. The laughter fell silent. The corridors that once seemed majestic now looked sinister and empty. The pool, the jewel of the house, was drained and closed forever. It became a crypt, a sealed monument to the worst day of their lives. All of Frank Seiberling's ambitions, all his battles for patents, for markets, for prestige, all of it turned to dust in the face of this quiet, personal tragedy. He had built a fortress to protect his family from the outside world, but he hadn't considered that the greatest threat would not come from the outside. It would come from within, from the heart of his own paradise. Stan Hywet ceased to be a dream palace. It became a mausoleum of memory. Every room, every object was now steeped in sorrow. The house that was meant to be a symbol of his dynasty's eternal life turned into a silent witness to its greatest loss. The stone that was meant to scream of triumph now whispered of the fragility of human life, and that whisper would never again fall silent. What was life like in this gigantic house, in this mausoleum of memory? On the surface, it continued its course, adhering to the rituals of high society. Behind the thick walls of Stan Hywet, time flowed differently. Here, the spectacle of the Gilded Age was still being performed, even when the era itself had already died. Guests continued to arrive. President William Taft, the genius inventor Thomas Edison, the pianist Ignacy Paderewski, whose fingers made the giant Aeolian organ roar, and, in an act of supreme irony, a frequent guest was Harvey Firestone, the sworn enemy, Seiberling's main competitor on the rubber battlefield. Here, in the neutral zone of this palace, they could temporarily lay down their arms and behave like gentlemen, discussing world affairs over a glass of whiskey from a secret cellar. After all, it was the time of prohibition. The family's life was also a series of landmark events. Their daughter Irene was getting married. The wedding of the century for all of Ohio. 1,200 guests on the estate lawns. Flowers, music, champagne. The last bright flash of former splendor. Gertrude Seiberling, the lady of the house, tried to fill it with art and music, hosting concerts and literary evenings. She was the heart of this house, trying to make it beat, despite the tragedy and financial difficulties. But this was just a facade. Behind the scenes of this perpetual celebration, another, quieter drama was unfolding. The drama of the empty corridors. The house was built as an ancestral home, a hive that was supposed to buzz with the voices of children and grandchildren. But the children grew up, and they didn't want to live in this museum. They built their own modern homes, cozy, bright, human-sized. They loved their parents, respected their legacy, but they instinctively fled from this gigantic, solemn prison. Frank's dream of a dynasty living under one roof for generations crumbled. He had built a house for the future, but the future chose other addresses. For Seiberling himself, the aging patriarch, Stan Hywet, turned into a gilded cage. After Gertrude's death in 1946, he was left almost alone in it. A huge, empty house with 65 rooms and one old man wandering its echoing halls. He was the keeper of his own myth, the last resident of a ghost town he himself had built. He would sit in his study, surrounded by the symbols of his former power, and look out the window at the valley where the factories he no longer managed smoked. He could listen to the silence in the great hall, where the music and laughter of hundreds of guests once resounded. The house that was meant to be his greatest legacy, his statement of immortality, was transforming into a monument to loneliness before his very eyes. He wanted to build a home for his family. Instead, he built a mausoleum for himself. But he had no idea that the true, unintentional legacy of this place had already been born, not in the gleaming halls of the palace, but in its most modest and inconspicuous corner. Great historical shifts rarely happen to the sound of fanfares. More often, they are born in silence, in the most unremarkable places, far from the centers of power. May 11th, 1935. While Frank Seiberling was battling the ghosts of the past in his enormous mansion, real history was being made right at his gates. Not in the Great Hall, not in the library paneled with rare wood, but in the modest gatekeeper's lodge, a small, cozy cottage built for the servants. On this day, two men met within its walls, two strangers united by one common, all-consuming hopelessness. One was a stockbroker from New York named Bill Wilson, a man of brilliant mind whose career and life had been destroyed by alcohol. The other was a surgeon from Akron, Dr. Bob Smith, a genius physician who could only operate when the tremor in his hands was subdued by a morning dose of gin. Both were what society called hopeless drunks, men written off, wrecks of their own lives. The meeting was arranged by Seiberling's daughter-in-law, Henrietta. She herself was part of a religious movement that believed in the power of frank conversation and mutual support. She simply wanted to help her friend Bill, who was in despair and on the verge of a relapse. The plan was simple. 15 minutes of polite conversation. Just one alcoholic talking to another. No one expected a miracle. But a miracle happened. The conversation, which was supposed to last 15 minutes, went on for 6 hours. 6 hours in the small living room of the gatekeeper's lodge. They didn't talk about business, politics, or the weather. They spoke of their shared obsession, of their powerlessness, of the guilt and loneliness that only someone who has been through that hell can understand. For the first time in their lives, Each of them spoke to a person who did not judge, did not moralize, but simply understood. Bill Wilson shared his fragile, newly found spiritual experience. Dr. Bob, a hardened skeptic, listened. That evening, in the modest cottage, in the shadow of the gigantic palace built on a foundation of ego and ambition, something entirely opposite was born. A movement based on humility, a fellowship based on mutual support, the idea that one suffering person can help another simply by sharing their story. This was the first conversation that would form the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous. The irony was cosmic. Frank Seiberling had carved a motto over the entrance to his castle: Non nobis solum, not for us alone. He invested these words with the meaning of hospitality, charity, a demonstration of his status. He could never have imagined that the true, profound meaning of this motto would be realized not by him, not in his luxurious halls. It would be embodied here, in the servants' lodge, thanks to two broken men who were not seeking fame or fortune, but simply a way to make it to the next day. The palace, built to glorify one man, unwittingly became the cradle for a movement that would save millions. The most important event in the history of Stan Hywet took place where the feet of noble guests had never tread, and it forever changed the destiny of this place. 1955, Frank Seiberling dies at the age of 95. He passes away quietly within the walls of his giant, empty castle. His era was over, and with it, it seemed, the story of Stan Hywet should have ended too. His 6 children faced the cruel choice that confronted the heirs of all of America's industrial dynasties: crippling inheritance taxes, astronomical upkeep costs. The world had changed. The age of palaces was over. Across the country, bulldozers were leveling the mansions of the Gilded Age, clearing space for shopping malls and suburban neighborhoods. The most logical, most financially sound decision was to demolish Stan Hywet and sell the land, to wipe it off the face of the earth. But in 1957, the Seiberling children made a decision that went against all logic, a decision that wasn't financial, but moral. They remembered the motto their father had carved above the entrance: Not for us alone. The words, which in his lifetime had sounded like a justification for luxury, now, after his death, took on a new power. The children decided to fulfill them literally. They donated the house, the gardens, all the furnishings, everything, to a non-profit organization to turn it into a museum for everyone. It was an act of unprecedented generosity. But what really saved Stan Hywet? Why did it survive when dozens of other, no less magnificent mansions fell? 2 forces saved it. 2 completely opposite forces that converged at a single point. The first was the will of one family to preserve the memory of their parents. But that would not have been enough. The second, and perhaps the main force, was the unique, unexpected legacy that was born in the Gate Lodge. The story of the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous transformed Stan Hywet from just a beautiful old house into something more: a place of pilgrimage, a symbol of hope on a global scale. People from all over the world who had never heard of the Goodyear rubber empire knew about this place. They didn't come to see the tapestries and the silver. They came to the humble lodge where 2 desperate men lit a candle that would light the way for millions. And today, we see the result of this paradox. Tourists wander through the immaculate gardens, admiring the creation of Warren Manning. Historians study the details of the Tudor architecture, but alongside them, on the very same paths, walk other people. AA members from Australia, Ireland, Japan. They stand silently by the gate lodge, touching its walls, feeling the echo of that 6-hour conversation. Stan Hywet survived not because it was the biggest or the most expensive. It survived because its story became bigger than the ambitions of its creator. Frank Seiberling built a monument to himself. He wanted to control his legacy, to carve it in stone, to make it eternal. But he failed. His dynasty did not last. His kingdom crumbled, and his palace found its true meaning only when it no longer belonged to him. The palace of one king became a beacon of hope for millions. The stone that was meant to speak of the power of one man now tells the story of the salvation of many. And in this lies the greatest irony and the highest justice of his legacy. Our journey through the corridors of Stan Hywet Hall comes to an end. But this was an odyssey, not through stone, wood, and glass, but through the very essence of human ambition, its triumph, its tragedy, and finally, its unintentional redemption. And at the end of this path, we arrive at one startling conclusion. The greatest structures live on not according to the designs of their creators, but by the will of history itself. A man builds walls to assert his will, but he can never control the echoes that will live within those walls. The motto carved in stone as a declaration of power became a prophecy fulfilled against the will of its author. A house born of egoism was saved by an act of humility. A palace built for a dynasty found immortality through the story of two broken men in a servant's lodge. Stan Hywet is not just a monument to the Gilded Age. It is a monument to the great irony of fate, which teaches us that the true meaning of our deeds is determined not at the moment of their completion, but decades later in the silence of empty halls where completely different voices begin to be heard. What will remain of our own grand plans when they are touched by the unpredictable course of time? And can a true legacy be born not from strength and success, but from vulnerability, failure, and a chance meeting in the most inconspicuous corner of our empire? The story of Stan Hywet Hall is not over. It continues in everyone who seeks their own meaning in it. Share in the comments which paradox of this place struck you the most. Your thoughts are a part of its living heritage. If this investigation made you think, please support our work and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to tell the stories hidden behind stone facades.